For our global audience, thank you for joining today's session with President Iván Duque of Colombia. This is going to be a very informative session. The president knows the United States quite well, having lived in Washington, D.C., where he had a distinguished career at the Inter-American Development Bank. And he brings a great deal of experience in dealing with the region and promoting regional economic integration in the Americas and fostering stronger ties between the United States and the region. Buenos dias. Good morning, President Duque. Thank you very much for joining us here today. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I wish next time we could do it in person. I love visiting your country, and as soon as we can do that, we will bring our business leaders back to your country. I just want to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Chamber today for joining the Chamber's Global Forum on Economic Recovery. As you know well, the U.S. Chamber has a long-standing commitment to Colombia and to its people. Our countries really do share an important strategic and economic partnership, which is why we launched the U.S. Chamber, launched the U.S. Colombia Business Council 4 years ago. I want to say personally how much we appreciate your strong support of the bilateral relationship, your advocacy for greater regional economic integration, and the support personally also of the bilateral council that the U.S. Chamber runs. Today we'll draw on both your experience as head of state of Colombia, but also your deep experience at the Inter-American Development Bank. And while we really want to talk about a lot of issues, we can't start a conversation about the global economic recovery and the imperative for inclusive growth without starting with COVID. This is obviously top of mind for your government, as well as many others in the global community, and we have to get COVID-19 under control. Recently, the U.S. Chamber, working with other organizations, established a global task force for pandemic response. This is intended to really help spur private sector coordination with governments to address COVID-19. But I want to start with you, Mr. President, asking you, how are you dealing with the latest surges in Colombia, and how can the business community and frankly the international community, including the United States, help you in Colombia and other countries address this devastating pandemic? Mr. President?
Well, thank you so much, Myron. It's a great honor to be here with you. And let me begin by saying that definitely COVID-19 has been the most complicated crisis for the world, maybe since World War II. And if I may mention, the reasons why this has been so complex is because it is definitely a healthcare crisis, but at the same time, it constitutes an economic crisis, and it constitutes an unemployment crisis, and it constitutes a social crisis. So it's a multi-dimensional situation. And in the case of Colombia, since we were attacked by the pandemic, we decided to have a response along three lines. The first is address the pressure on the healthcare system. That's why we duplicated their ICU capacity from 5,400 to more than 13,000 today. So it was a very important expansion. And we're now the leaders in ICU capacity per 100,000 inhabitants in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we also decided to improve testing, train people from the medical community, and at the same time be able to track and to isolate people that were positive cases. So I think that was a very important evolution. But I think on the other hand, we had to do something very significant in terms of protecting the poorest of the poor and the people who could be the most affected by the crisis. And that's why we launched a social safety net program that has allowed us to attend almost 10 million families around the country with conditional and non-conditional cash transfers and the giving back the VAT tax for the poorest of the poor, and be able to install a program of guarantees so that we can ensure that people in the private sector could get loans from the banking system out of 100 pesos, 90% was guaranteed by the government. And we also decided to put together for the first time in our history a payroll subsidy, where we paid 40 or 50% of the payroll for the minimum wage of formal workers. So it was also a program aimed to protect them. And we decided to launch last year a program that is called Compromise for Colombia, which is our equivalent of a New Deal, so that we have infrastructure, energy, tertiary roads, housing, tourism, agricultural development to trigger growth and to be able to generate more than 2 million jobs. So at this moment, what we want to get is to grow this year above 5%. What we also want this year is to be able to to see a boost in different sectors that are going to be dynamic for job generation. And if I may say something, Myron, we have been able to see this in a perspective where, in terms of the pandemic, in regarding indicators like deaths per million and contagions per million and lethality rate, I think we look in a much better shape than many countries around the world and even many developed countries. So I think those are, in a nutshell, the things that we have done. But now we're getting into a process where we are moving fast on vaccination. We expect to vaccinate 35 million Colombians by the end of the year or sooner. And we expect the country to have the growth that I mentioned above 5%. And I hope that tomorrow that the number that will come out from our National Bureau of Statistics about the growth in the first quarter of 2021 can come with a message that is the recession is over and now we're getting back to positive growth lines. So that's how I would respond to your question, Myron.
Well, Mr. President, I do want to talk about growth rates, but before I do, let me just return to one aspect of your question that I had initially, which is how can the international community help out Colombia at this time and other countries that have been hit hard? What do you want from the private sector, including from the United States?
The most important thing that can be done in a post-pandemic scenario, and actually in the times that we're living, is to nearshore operations from around the world to the Americas, because I believe that nearshoring, considering that we're close to market, can represent the most important opportunity for Latin America and the Caribbean, but especially for a country like Colombia. Colombia will be celebrating 200 years of diplomatic relations with the United States in 2022. We have a good set of U.S. corporations that are based in Colombia to attend the Latin American and Caribbean market. But I would say, Myron, that at this moment, the most important thing is that nearshoring can represent a very significant opportunity. And also, I think the United States can really help us to have a larger stock of vaccines in the next 2 months. Because yes, we have bought the vaccines and we have had the flow of the vaccines. But if we get to have a larger stock, let's say a 10 million vaccine stock, I think that will trigger a more dynamic process of vaccination in our countries, especially because I think we're moving in the right direction according to our plan, but we have the possibility to be able to give something close to 300,000 vaccines per day. So if we have a bigger stock, I think that can accelerate the vaccination process in Latin America, in our country, and that can represent an opportunity to gain some normality, if we could call it like that.
Okay, so it's really
something that I would like to mention. I think it will be interesting as well for the United States through DFC to mobilize investment and be able to use financial products such as guarantees for companies to issue debt with the possibility of having longer term and better rates.
So we'll take up your challenge and talk to our government about the vaccine issue and, of course, about the DFC. I want to turn to inclusive growth because you talked about the 5% target, which is actually a pretty bullish target. And I know that business leaders and government leaders, we're all focused on the imperative for inclusive growth. Really, frankly, because the world is recovering from this pandemic and it will be staged recovery. You have made such great progress in Colombia in reducing poverty by nearly half. But I think the pandemic has obviously had an impact on the economy and has diminished some of those gains. So you talked about how you're trying to address that in Colombia. but how concerned are you about rising poverty rates, not just in your country, but in the region? And how do we take solutions, practical solutions to strengthen the middle class?
Well, I would say, Myron, that in our case, we definitely had a growth on poverty. We passed from 37% to 42%. And if we would have not done anything with the social programs that we did, we could have gotten even to 50%. So I think the social programs have been working, and it has giving us the possibility to contain part of the negative effects from the pandemic in terms of poverty. And actually, when we look at the rural areas, what we saw was a reduction on the poverty rate, because we were able to mobilize non-conditional cash transfers to many families. Now, how can we resolve the situation of poverty and try to be back where we were before the pandemic? I think it's also regarding employment, because there is a clear linkage between employment or unemployment and poverty. So if we get to recover formal jobs, I think that will have an impact. And as we start getting back to normality in the education system, whether it's alternancy or whether it's just continuous journey, what matters is that many mothers around Latin America, and especially in Colombia, have been taking care of their kids at home. And why? Because their kids are educating themselves virtually. So once they start recovering presential education, I think that is also going to trigger the possibility that more women are going to look for jobs. Now, are the jobs going to be available? I think that's the kind of help we need, because yes, investment, transformation, and also value-added chains are mechanisms to generate that employment in our country. And we're actually thinking of a policy where we can subsidize Social Security if you hire young people between 18 and 28 for the first 5 years, and if we do the same with women that have lost their jobs during the pandemic. So those are two policies that I mentioned that could be interesting to evaluate with U.S. corporations that are based in Colombia, so that they can also play a starting role in this kind of solutions.
Well, we'll take up the challenge, Mr. President, to look at those issues with your government and your private sector. You have talked about briefly and passionately in the past about rebalancing some of the value chains to the Americas, and frankly, with the focus on Colombia, but also the region at large. You referenced some other opportunities to drive regional economic growth. Are you at all worried about what's going on in the region? Are you worried about efforts to impede trade flows, some protectionist initiatives undertaken in an environment where countries are really struggling to recover from the COVID-19 situation? Or are you optimistic? Where do you stand on this?
I mean, I'm always an optimistic, Myron. I'm always an optimistic, but I should say this: we're living in moments of international politics that are highly polarized. I mean, you have suffered it in the United States. We have suffered it in Colombia. We have seen this around the world. And there are going to be many political cycles in Latin America in the next months. And we will have the election in Peru in June, and we'll have the election in Chile in November. We will have the election in Colombia next year. We'll have the election in Brazil next year. So we know that there's a big political cycle. Now, COVID-19 has driven many societies into many problems. We all have to move out of those problems. But I think what we're seeing is that there are a lot of social sentiments that are arising. There are a lot of social sentiments that can turn into fury by demagogues or populists trying to capitalize those sentiments in their favor. So it's very important at this moment that whatever we do in terms of protecting the people that have been more affected by the pandemic, it's done fast. And we have seen it in Colombia. We have seen that there is a national strike movement, that it has also political linkages. We have seen that there are genuine, peaceful claims from citizens. But we have also seen that there are people who are trying to use violence to generate chaos in different places. These kinds of situations are going to be seen not only in Colombia, are going to be seen in the rest of the world, maybe in the next year and a half, and especially when many countries will have to go and find the funding to pay for all they have expended during the pandemic, and at the same time for all that is going to be needed for the next years. So I see those red lights, but I also believe that it is a time for opportunity. So if we build national consensus towards many issues, I think that supports and helps and allows us to be very effective. Now, the challenge is it's going to be more complicated within a political cycle, because people in the political cycles will like to take advantage of whatever they can to win elections. So I think we have to separate those things. And that's why in our country, there's no re-election. I'm highly committed to fulfill the objectives of our national development plan. And we hope that this year we can put together a plan to respond to the needs of the young people who are the ones who are claiming peacefully that they want to have better opportunities for the future. And that only happens if we have a vibrant private sector and we have a growing set of investments from abroad in our country.
Well, we're optimistic, too, about the recovery in the United States and the long-term prospects for the world. But tell us what you think the United States' role should be in the region at this critical moment. You mentioned, obviously, helping out with vaccines. But beyond that, what should we be looking to from Washington? What do you think is really critically important as the region is struggling to recover from the pandemic?
That's a great question, Myron. That's a great question. And I think at this moment, there is an opportunity. This year, 2021, we're going to be celebrating, or we are celebrating, 60 years of the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was launched by President Kennedy with his charisma and his vision that there had to be a close relationship between the United States and Latin America. I think nearshoring can be a practical, instrumental, and effective vehicle to generate that sort of a new partnership and or new alliance. That is very important. The second thing is we are in Latin America emerging markets, Myron. We are seeing now that inflation rates in the United States starting to rise. And the biggest worry in most of the countries where we have reduced our interest rates is that if we reduce our interest rates and the United States starts pushing the interest rates high, what happens is that there might be a pressure of outflows from capital from Latin America to safe havens, in that case, the United States. So we have to consider that whatever decision the United States makes on our monetary policy in the following months, it is definitely going to have an impact in Latin America. And we don't want to see that as a negative impact, because we really need to have investment and liquidity flows to our region. But that's something that I should highlight. Now, something the United States has to do, in my opinion, humbly, is that there are mechanisms in which the United States can do things faster with the region. Obviously, the U.S. has DFC, has USAID, and many other agencies. But for example, I think the capital increase of the Inter-American Development Bank is something that it will be very important to have, so that the bank can irrigate not only resources, but can develop new tools and new products that fulfill the needs of countries in Latin America. Like, for example, partial credit guarantees, like, for example, policy-based loans with a more rapid response or disbursement, and the possibility to have post-COVID lines. And if I may say something, I think this is the opportunity for the United States also to work along with the IMF, and that I believe can be done by Secretary Yellen. And it is to sit down with the IMF and create post-COVID fiscal recovery plans for the good performers in Latin America. Those are ideas that I have in my mind, Myron, and that I think the U.S. can make a big influence.
Mr. President, if I had time, I would go into more depth about inflation and the risks for the region. But let me switch to one last topic. I want to talk about climate change, because this is another shared global challenge. You participated in last month's White House Global Summit on climate change. Tell us what your government's trying to do in this area, what you're trying to achieve in terms of climate targets, and how important this is to not just sustainability, but in the context of dealing with the Amazon and the issues around deforestation. So, Mr. President, your thoughts?
Myron, I would say this. I was reading Bill Gates' book some weeks ago, and he said something very interesting. He said, let's start with two numbers. The first number he mentioned was 51 billion tons that are generated year over year of greenhouse gases and or CO2 emissions. And he said the next challenge is zero. What does that mean? That we need to move to a world of carbon neutrality. Now, Colombia only represents 0.6% of all the greenhouse gases emissions or CO2 emissions around the world, 0.6. But Colombia is one of the top 20 more threatened countries by the effects of climate change. So what can Colombia do and what could be a reference? We have said publicly that by 2030, we're going to cut by 51% our CO2 emissions. And we said that we want to reach carbon neutrality in 2050. Those are the goals. How do we make it possible? We are accelerating energy transition like no other time before in our history. We're passing from 0.2% of our energy matrix based on non-conventional renewables to more than 14% by the end of my term next year. That's the biggest energy transition. And if I may say this, we're going to pass from 30 megawatts to more than 2,000 megawatts just in my administration. But we also said, let's talk about clean transportation. We approved the electric vehicle bill, and now we have the largest public transportation fleet based on electrical vehicles. We also have the largest cargo fleet based on electrical vehicles. And even in 2020, the year when the pandemic arose, the sales of electric vehicles was above 70%. This year, we're going to be above 100% compared to the previous year and the previous year. So that means that's going on well. We also think that the circular economy policy is crucial with all the industrial sector, where we assume that we have to produce conserving and conserve producing, and reducing the individual carbon footprint so that we all know how to reduce, reuse, recycle, and how can we have better performance in our daily life regarding how intensive in terms of energy is our daily life. But I should also mention the protection of the Amazon, the protection of the high altitude ecosystems through the Leticia Pact and the Biodiverse Cities initiative that we launched with Klaus Schwab yesterday. And last but not least, Myron, something that we all have to do. The best technology to capture CO2 are trees. So that's why we engage in the 1 Trillion Trees Initiative that was launched in the WEF 2 years ago with Mark Benioff and Klaus Schwab. And we said that we were going to plant 180 million trees by the end of my administration. We're going to close this year with 125 million trees planted, and we'll get to the 180 million trees planted by August next year. So in a nutshell, those are the things that we're doing in Colombia, and definitely fighting climate change is the most challenging issue of our time.
Mr. President, Bill Gates is going to be closing the two-day program, so he'll welcome the fact that you spoke to his book. But let me just say this. Your commitment to plant trees, your commitment to climate change is very much welcome. And of course, we hope that other countries in the region contribute as well. And we look forward to being part of the dialogue with your government and others in Latin America. I would just want to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Chamber and our global audience for participating today. There's a lot in your answers that we could not get deeper into, but you gave us a lot to think about. What you should take away from this is our commitment to your country, to your people, to inclusive growth, to supporting your recovery from COVID, and of course, our commitment to the longstanding ties between the United States and Colombia. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone for joining today's Global Forum on Economic Recovery. Next time in
Thank you
person,
so much.
Mr. President. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much, Myron. I look forward to see you in person pretty soon. All the best.
Okay, thank you.